Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So I need you to help update my priors. That is to say, it has been a long time since I have looked for an apartment, and no, I'm not looking for one now, but I want to stay in touch with what other people go through. The housing market, as we know right now, is not exactly a good place to be. So what does it take to get an apartment now?
A reference?
You need to have a reference, okay? They don't want to just give an apartment to some stranger off the street.
No priors.
No priors. They don't want somebody who's been convicted of something. Credit. They'll check your credit to make sure that you can pay.
Security deposit.
Security deposit. First month, last month rent. That.
The first child.
The first child, exactly. And key money, right? Oh no, that was Japan. Sorry, that was the first time I ever had to do an apartment entirely on my own. And in Japan, in addition to some of the things you've mentioned, first, last month rent, security deposit, you also are expected to pay key money. Now, it's a bribe. It is a holdover from the post-World War II era, when much of Japan had been devastated, and it meant that housing was in an especially short supply, and people who had apartments or rooms to let, well, there were lots of people who were interested in them. And there were limits on how much they could price gouge for the rent. But there wasn't a limit to the gratuity that would go along with providing you the keys. And so it became customary, that is to say, mandatory, to give a bribe in the name of key money that would then show your landlord that you were indeed committed to being a good tenant. And so, yes, when I was getting my first apartment in Japan, I got to hand over an envelope with a couple $1,000 in it that went towards no rent, no security deposit, no maintenance, nothing, just as a thank you very much for allowing me to live here, promise to them. Yeah, I don't think that is currently allowed in the U.S. Give it a couple of years, we'll see, as the housing market continues to fluctuate, to be diplomatic. But why is that something that all of you groaned when I mentioned? I mean, why shouldn't the landlord be able to be encouraged to rent to you for a sign of your seriousness, of your commitment to being a tenant there?
That's the pretext.
That's the pretext. So, I mean,
they really want a higher rent, but it's the pretext for charging a higher rent.
but the rent isn't monthly. You know, it was a one-time only fee. I didn't get it back, but I mean, I didn't have to pay an extra rent, a higher rent every single month. So it's a good deal, right? And no one here is a landlord, apparently, because if you were a landlord, maybe you'd be thinking, you know, the word bribe is such a negative connotation, but a symbol of commitment, a symbol of your seriousness, surely that would be permissible. I mean, after all, isn't that why we built the tabernacle? Isn't that why we were offering sacrifices to God? Weren't those symbols of our seriousness? Weren't those actions that showed our devotion in order to bribe the Almighty?
No.
Well, no. But you'd be forgiven for thinking they were. Certainly within the pagan world, bribes were unabashedly seen as being, sacrifices were unabashedly being seen as bribes. You were about to go onto a long sea voyage. You bribed Poseidon with a great big sacrifice because you were putting your life in Poseidon's hands. And if you gave him enough, he might let you get through the sea voyage alive. If you were about to undertake a military campaign, having been drafted, you would offer up a sacrifice to Ares, hoping that you would not just have victory, but more importantly, you'd come back alive and more or less intact. These were how you dealt with powerful people. Why would it not be how you would deal with powerful beings? You bribe your local officials, you bribe the local council, you bribe anyone you can get away with in order to get a better standing, of course you're going to bribe the divinities in your pantheon as well. And when Judaism allowed sacrifices, it did open the door for many people to imagine that these actions were also continuing in the same vein, that they were bribes. But to unpack this, we have to see what Judaism is actually hoping that we will accomplish through the act of giving a sacrifice. And we're doing this now because we're coming to the end of the book of Exodus. We have just built the Mishkan, and for quite a few weeks we are going to be in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which has a whole lot to say about sacrifices. So I want to make sure we're starting off with the right frame of mind. So for something to be a bribe, it has to be of benefit to the recipient, right? Otherwise, what is it? I'm not going to bribe my future landlord by handing them some pocket lint. I'm not going to bribe my future landlord by giving them some pebbles I found outside. Why? Because what good is the lint and the pebbles to the landlord? It is not considered to be of benefit, and therefore it is not going to be persuasive that they have benefited from me and thus would like to reciprocate back to me. Well, when we take that to its logical extreme, what could we possibly give God that would be of benefit to God? The prophets and the Psalms make this very clear, that there is no amount of sacrifices that could ever benefit God. No matter how many millions of cows you sacrificed or how many millions of jugs of oil you used in libations, God's not getting richer from this. God's not getting fuller or happier in the tummy because of all of these things that have been offered. And therefore, there is no benefit, there is no bribe. Instead, we have to try and change how we are approaching this. So we do not look at it as a bribe, holding on to that concept of God as not needing what we are trying to sacrifice, and instead recognizing what we need through the process of sacrifice. So how do we benefit then through a process of sacrifice? Well, as humans, we do have this predisposition to feeling things more deeply when we do them physically. Anybody here will tell you that knowing that somebody loves you is all very nice and warm and fuzzy and makes you feel good, but it doesn't hurt to hear it every now and then. It doesn't hurt to go out and have a special day together now and again. It doesn't hurt maybe to have some flowers now and then. That those physical acts are not attempting to bribe the other person into their continued affection with you. Hopefully no relationship will be based on something so flimsy, but instead they are a way of demonstrating what we already believe, what we already feel, and what we wish to celebrate that it exists rather than create that relationship, that reciprocity, which is the purpose of a bribe. So too for the sacrifices. When we offered up a sheep or a goat or a cow or a dove or even just grain, it wasn't, I sure hopes this gets God to do what I want. It was instead saying, I really am, at this moment, feeling something that requires me to do something physical in response to that feeling. And Judaism gave us some guidelines for that, so we wouldn't go off the deep end. We wouldn't sacrifice our entire herd, and we wouldn't do nothing, but instead be guided in those emotions to a helpful and limited action. So when there is a child born, you can give a sacrifice. When you are trying to overcome the guilt of a mistake that you have already rectified, but still wish to feel like you have sealed that part of your life in the past, a sacrifice can give you that sense of ease, of peace. When you want to celebrate good fortune or happiness in general, another sacrifice gives you a way to share that and to share the meat of that sacrifice with others in the community so that others can partake of that joyous moment as well. The sacrifices were not intended to change God. They were intended to mark, to signify, to celebrate changes that had already occurred in ourselves. Sadly, we know from the rest of the Bible that far too often in our history, people would treat the sacrifices nonetheless mechanically. They would act as though the sacrifice was a bribe. They would act as though they could do whatever they wanted as long as they threw God a bone, quite literally, that they could get away with murder, that they could get away with theft, that they could get away with, well, literal bribes, whether they were bribing a judge or whether they were the judge receiving the bribe. And we know that eventually this kind of corruption, both spiritual and civil corruption, is what led to the downfall of not only the first temple period, but the second temple period as well. Hopefully we have learned from that lesson, not just about our relationship with God and how we can relate and express our moments without the trappings of bribery, but also the dangers of bribery in general, and that morality at its heart is the greatest act we can do of devotion. Finer than any sacrifice we could ever give, the act of our heart and the act of our ethics is the ultimate statement of our relationship with God. And it is there that we will find our deepest fulfillment and the deepest celebration, the deepest enshrinement of God in this world. Shabbat Shalom.